In our first video, we defined what industry was and we briefly looked at the history of the Industrial Revolution and how it spread. So in the second video, we're going to look, our second and third videos, we're going to look at why industry is located in certain areas. So this is going to comprise the ideas of site and situation factors, favors least cost theory, and ideas of why industries are grouped in certain areas, but also talk about deindustrialization. So that's what these next few videos are going to cover. So within that, we want to evaluate the decisions of why industries are located in specific areas. So why do we target industries in certain parts of the globe, and explaining the difference between those site and situation factors. So we have to ask ourselves at the end of the day, why industries are located in certain areas in terms of what is the ultimate goal of most businesses and industries. Now, obviously, I'm not talking for all, but at the end of the day, the majority of them are out there to make profit. Okay, how can they make the most money? And a lot of it comes down to cost. All right, so what is the least costly way to make the most money? And a lot of it comes back down, at least initially, to site and situation factors. All right, so that's where we're going to pull it up here with the definitions of site factor and situation factors, which we're going to break down in the next few slides. So site factors include the physical location of the place, including the unique factors that are around it that help us produce the actual products. So that includes land, labor, and capital, which we will revisit either in this video near the end or in the next video. The other one is situation factors. So the location of a place relative to that of another. So we want to understand what is the best location to maximize profits by looking at transportation costs. So what is considered to be more expensive? Transporting it as a before it is actually made into a product, so before it becomes a finished product from its inputs, or transporting it from the factory to the marketplace. Considering that if it's more expensive to do one or the other, that's where you're going to choose to be closer. Wherever it's going to be more expensive is where you're going to put it closer by, either the inputs or the markets themselves. All right, so you choose that, you choose to be closer to the not the factories, you choose to be closer to the resources, I'm going to change that, or the factories based on what is cheaper to transport. So it's cheaper to transport to the market than it is than its inputs to factories. The factories will be closer to the inputs, okay, because it's going to be more expensive. So this includes things like materials, energy, transporting machinery, and supporting services. Often this is the case of what we call bulk reducing industries. So this is where it puts way more than the final product. So the stuff that you're putting together for your product, way more initially than what the final product is going to, the resulting final product is actually going to look like. All right. So with bulk reducing, that would be an example of, steel or copper industry. So an example would be, typically it's harder and more difficult and way heavier when steel and copper are kind of in their initial forms. Than what you're actually turning it into. So whether that's like car parts or alloys and that such, you reduce the actual size of the actual initial copper and steel to actually make them into said finished product that you put on a car, for example, because it makes it lighter, makes it more sleek and designed the way it needs to be, and then you transport it to the next pot, making it bulk reducing. All right, now if it's the opposite, where it's more expensive to transport goods to the market than it is to the factory is going to be located to the market. So this would be an example of a bulk gaining industry, where it actually is going to weigh more as the final product than it is in the initial forms. So examples, we'll kind of see some of those here in a few minutes or in the next slide or two. So then we also have single market manufacturers, so things that, or groups or businesses or companies that make, a certain product that's only available to certain clientele. It's not, readily available. Like, here I have, my water bottle. That's going to be readily available to the vast majority of the people. So you got to find, or in this case, examples of people who are going to be needing a certain service. So thus, it's not going to be, targeted towards the mass public. It is to certain corporations or businesses. So you could think, one example might be stuff for airlines. Okay. Because again, if you're, or for people that are, working on airplanes, typically you're probably not going to have those all over the country. You're going to have them in areas, producing factories and maybe some, airports that, need, some extra parts here and there. So that'd be an example of single market manufacturer. And then also your perishable items. So items that are only good for a short time. So think food, newspapers, things that are going to, become either spoiled or irrelevant very, very quickly. Okay. So you might want to think about how this connects back to the von Thunen model from the agriculture chapter, especially because that's primary and these are secondary economic activities. right? So the book also talks about, location of steel production, shifting, all in section 2. I'm not going to go over that here, but the book does a good job with that. So when we look here at Lake Superior, in mines, mineral exploration, and mineral leasing in the Lake Superior Watershed District, this goes back now about a decade to 2013. You can kind of see recent mineral exploration where they're looking for minerals in these, red triangles. And then you also have operating mines and kind of, these little squares over here. So you can kind of see North Shore Mine right there. And then there's a few others kind of, spread throughout Canada, Michigan, and Wisconsin on Michigan's, upper peninsula up here. So one thing to consider is the fact that this would be considered a bulk reducing industry because you want to have, when you're pulling out iron ore, copper, taconite, nickel mines, things of that nature, you want to make sure that those are pretty close, your factories are pretty close by, because that is going to be a very heavy substance when you pull it out of the ground and easier to transport afterwards once you've actually, again, reduced it to a more alloy or manageable form that you're going to be using to put on a different product. So that's where you're going to find more factories, especially so, using Minnesota as the example. Your taconite mines, kind of up here, kind of on the Minnesota Iron Range, so in St. Louis County. And if you look, more importantly, in, again, St. Louis County, now, mind you, it doesn't say what percentage of the population that is. It is a fairly large amount of people kind of on the North Shore and also, again, in the Duluth, St. Louis Iron Range area, based on, the importance of mining within this. So it even goes into Itasca County with Grand Rapids, Hibbing, Virginia, all the way up there. So one thing you see if you're living in Minnesota is, every winter and fall when they do the, state tournaments and they show those on TV, they also talk about and have advertisements related to mining in Minnesota because that is a good time to get the audience aware of more Minnesota-based activities. And so you will see things that are arguing for or against, most of them, however, in favor of mining in northern Minnesota because it's a very large part of the incomes that are up there. And whether that's a good or a bad thing for the environment is another discussion to be having, but that's not what we're doing here. We're just talking about mining in Minnesota for that. Now, examples of bulk gaining, this would be, bottling factories, filling up, plastic and glass bottles with refreshments. Those are considered a bulk gaining because, again, they get heavier once you fill the liquid into said bottle. Single market manufacturers, buttons, shoelaces, things of that nature, which, again, you wouldn't find in too many other areas. Perishable products, we kind of already said that one. So we also want to connect the situation factors to the transportation of inputs and products. So in particular, how do we get product from one spot to another? Once it's finished, how do we get it to the marketplace? Oh, we can also think about how we get it from, its initial location to the actual factory. So typically, in today's day and age, it's trucks, trains, ships, and air. So we want to consider what are the benefits and drawbacks of each mode over short and long-term periods, access to markets, especially in this global age when we talk about globalization and how fast people like to get their goods once they paid for them. How long does that necessarily take? What's the best form? But also, what is the most cost-effective? What is the most environmentally friendly? Those are all things to be considering. So we might maybe, in a few years here, even start putting drones up on this as an example, right? So typically, on average, the farther you transport it, the lower the cost per mile or kilometer, because the further you transport means that, you're not transporting it as long, you have fewer obstacles time-wise, again, in most cases. So this is kind of the idea of, if you're in a factory and, you're 10 miles away from your location and it's city streets, that's going to be more expensive to transport over that shorter period than if it's like 100 miles away based on the per mileage or per kilometer distance that you're traveling, because typically it becomes more cost effective with how we spend and use fuel. All right. So most companies, in terms of sending stuff to the factories or to their consumers, is usually using multiple modes for transportation. So they're not just using trucks or trains or ships or airplanes. They're using a number of these types of transportation to get the goods from one spot to the next. All right. So why companies do this? It's just because out of necessity to transport it within all that stuff. All right. Because again, it may not necessarily always be cost effective just to fly it from location A to location B and then location C. It might be more cost effective to fly it from location A to location B and then to bring it on a truck to location C. All right. I definitely know that Amazon isn't flying over my place of living every time I'm buying something and dropping it overhead with a little parachute. All right, it's still being delivered by a person on an Amazon truck whenever that happens. But how it gets to that Amazon fulfillment center, however, that's what's different, or how it gets to the post office. That's the differences within this. And so when they are changing their transportation mode, it's what we call a break of bulk point. Okay, and that's where you go from, again, just transferring, it from airplane to truck, truck to airplane, or any of the others from one to the other. Okay. Now, these are often at seaports, harbors, or airports. Why? Because typically a lot of our stuff comes from abroad. All right, so you have to think that there has to be, again, multiple modes for these locations, and typically, these are the best spots for them. Okay. Also, we have to consider the fact that using multiple modes of transportation, even though it might be cost effective, will still end up costing money. Okay, because you got to pay for both types of transportation. You got to pay for the labor involved for the people, loading, unloading, driving, or piloting those, transportations or modes of transportation. You have to pay for storage from time to time, waiting for one mode of transportation to the other. Hence why we have up here these containers that are used predominantly on ships. Ships are still, or I should say, oceanic transportation is still the #1 leading use of transportation globally for international transportation of goods and services, or I should say just the goods. Because again, if we're getting stuff from China or from India or things going from the United States to those other locations, and you think, what's again the most cost effective to ship the very most amount of goods and products, it's going to be ships, because they can carry more, even though they might take longer than obviously planes might. The ability to carry all that is obviously reduced, or again, you can make fewer trips, and even though it might take longer with ships, to carry more goods. So again, you have to consider what are the benefits of how much they can carry and all those other things. Now, we also, and there's a nice little video that I have in here on containerization. It's about 5-6 minutes when we're through time. So then the other piece of that transportation is what we call just-in-time delivery. All right, now what just-in-time delivery does is it pretty much the stuff arrives right when you need it or right before you need it. All right, this comes more, with our, globalization of we need to have products right then and there, and over a short period of time. But not every place has very large inventories and storage facilities. Usually, we talk about imports for car parts, computer parts, or even an example of food for restaurants. Thinking you want fresh vegetables every day, you're not going to order the vegetables and have it sitting there in your fridge for 2 weeks before you use it. Okay, you're going to want it, day of, day before, if you want to have fresh food. So the same kind of thing, if I'm importing a car part, I'm not going to have a bunch of tires just sitting around at my, repair shop, my car repair shop, on the off chance that somebody needs this specific set of tires. So this is what just-in-time delivery is for, is to have those connections in order to get something that it needs to be there right away. But that way I'm not the one holding on to it. I have to have those connections to people and industries to ensure that I get it right away when my customers need it. So the setback, however, is in relation to, well, high demand, labor issues in case there are strikes. That way I think something might interfere with me getting it. Traffic issues, weather, can all affect the just-in-time delivery. And this will also connect it to agglomeration, which we will be talking about let's skip ahead actually. Let's go talk agglomeration quick. Okay, so this comes by why competitors and supporting industries are located near each other. So we're going to wrap it up here. So Max Weber's least cost theory, okay, location of a factory is based on minimizing transportation costs with situation factors, labor, and agglomeration. So labor will connect back with site factors. So what is the cheapest of all three of those combined? And agglomeration, okay, is when we cluster similar productive industries together for collective or cooperative use of infrastructure and sharing labor. So again, I used to use, growing up, my family, we used Precision Tune, Auto Care, and Plymouth. But Precision Tune doesn't have, windshield wipers. They don't have, glass for windshields and cars or tires for every single car that comes in. Okay, but they can order next door to like Napa Auto Parts and ones that are just right next door or just a few miles away for that just-in-time delivery when they need it to sustain those things, and that's what agglomeration does. All right. It can also include competitors, so people who are very, really close. So I see hotels and restaurants being very, very close to each other. Same with gas stations. And then the final one is the growth poles, which is the specific industries that go together, because they can be specific to certain regions. Think Silicon Valley. So it's agglomeration of certain industries, and then they grow out from there. And that wraps up situation factors.